Hey everyone, welcome to Weekends on Jacobin. I'm Anna Kasparian, joined by Nando Vila, my trusty co-host. Nando, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. We had a few technical glitches, to start the stream, but we're here for you people. Don't worry. We're going to deliver the takes. We're going to deliver the news. That's the important thing. We look great. We always look great, but the most important thing is the takes.
Yes, Nando, according to my mom, you always look great. And the Washington Post, and I'm sure many others. But yeah, we did have some technical issues. Sorry for the late start today, but we do have a great show ahead. Hopefully, we can actually carry out a smart conversation about Donald Trump's Supreme Court pick. We're going to have a Yale professor of jurisprudence and history to join us to talk about that. Samuel Moyn will be joining us later in the show. Wow. I am going to engage in a debate with Nando, something that hasn't been sitting well with me. And I felt like I needed to speak up. So we're going to actually start the show with that. Let's get right to it.
Let's do it.
Nando seems to have some sort of issue with Daniel Dale. Now, he is the CNN fact checker. On name alone, on title alone, I get it. You can suspect that there's going to be some weak sauce activity by any type of legacy media or corporate media fact checker. However, I think Daniel Dale is okay. Okay?
Yeah.
I'm not going to insult him by calling him dorky, but he can be dorky, and I don't think that's an insult. But I think in the context of mainstream media fact checkers, who usually tend to be awful, awful people who do these insane, unfair fact checks on socialists and progressives, Daniel Dale seems to be a little more fair. Okay. So I want to give you an example, and then I want to hear your case for why you're such a Daniel Dale hater. So this is after Donald Trump's RNC speech. This is the video that went viral. Many people were talking about it because he went 3.5 minutes straight fact-checking Trump. I'm not going to make you watch the whole 3.5 minute video, but I'll give you a little taste. Watch.
Anderson, this president is a serial liar, and he serially lied tonight. I counted preliminarily more than 20 false or misleading claims. I want to go through a whole bunch of them quickly because I think it's all important. Trump said Joe Biden is, quote, talking about taking down the border wall. Biden has specifically, explicitly rejected that idea. He just said he'll stop further additional construction. Trump claimed, as always, that he is the one who passed the Veterans' Choice Law. Barack Obama signed that into law in 2014. Trump signed a 2018 law to modify it. Trump said, I have done more for the African-American community than any president since Abraham Lincoln. That is ludicrous. Lyndon Johnson, for one, signed the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. Trump again touted a, quote, record 9 million job gain over the past 3 months. He didn't mention, as usual, that gain follows a record 22 million job loss over the previous 2 months. He said he'll, quote, continue to lower drug prices. They've increased during his presidency. He said they opened a Jerusalem embassy for less than 500,000. Early documents show it was at least 21 million.
Okay, so you guys get the picture. He went on and on and on, and his fact checks were fair, they were accurate. But Nando, the thing that I really appreciated about that video, especially as someone who, knows the annoying minutia of ethical journalism, so-called journalists are not supposed to ever refer to politicians as liars, right? So they never say it. And it's a rule, right? If it's an unspoken rule for the most part, but they avoid doing it because they don't want to seem as though their critique or whatever it is too partisan. And so I appreciate that he calls Donald Trump a liar because that's what Donald Trump is. I wish and I hope that in the future, when politicians are lying, that type of criticism is extended to them as well. And it's not just saved specifically for Donald Trump. But look, it's not easy to stand there or sit there in his case for 3.5 minutes and fact check without a script, which most, television broadcasters do have.
I'm useless without. For sure.
You're not. But you get what I'm saying. Like, I think
totally.
he's a little better than most of the crap that we get on cable news.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the reason why I recoil from that kind of thing is because the fact check industry writ large, which is something that is relatively recent in journalism, has proven time and time again to be a sort of referee for the status quo. There's the famous Glenn Kessler of the Washington Post, who was kind of the most famous fact checker in America, is like notorious for this, right? I mean, he constantly cites incredibly shoddy reasons for calling things like, Medicare for all, like unfeasible or something. And he cites that as fact, right? There was also the absurd kind of ticky-tack nature of it. I remember when Philip Bump of the Washington Post fact-checked Bernie Sanders for saying that the average campaign donation or something was $27. Instead, it was like $27.46, or something like $27.46 or some absurd fact check like that. And I remember even the PolitiFact, when they do their lie of the year, use an Obama statement on the Affordable Care Act, which was plainly not the lie. It probably wasn't even a lie, let alone the whopper kind of the year. Anyway, the fact checking industry writ large, I find to be incredibly problematic. I mean, they're basically hall monitors for the status quo, right? Anyone who kind of deviates from the status quo in any meaningful way is going to incur the wrath of the fact checkers. Daniel Dale specifically, and it wasn't in that part of the clip, but later on in the clip, for example, he does this thing which I find just problematic from a fact checking and journalistic standpoint, which is Donald Trump claimed that the Chinese want Joe Biden to win. Our intelligence agencies say that the Chinese want Joe Biden to win because it's he's citing the intelligence agency report or intel or whatever as fact. And I don't, that's not how that works. And the broader point being that facts alone have no content. Facts devoid of ideology are nothing. They're just random data points. If you don't connect them to tell a bigger story, they're essentially meaningless. And the biggest problem with people at CNN or any of the fact checkers is that they don't realize how much ideology is baked into their own quote unquote fact checks. And
right.
It's plainly obvious for me to see, but they don't see it. They're like a fish in water. They don't know that they're in water, but they're drowning in ideology. But they just don't know that. They don't see it that way. They're just calling balls and strikes. But it's not true. Yeah,
no, I totally agree. I agree with you in that regard, right? So in the context of this weird fact-checking media industry, excuse me,
Salud.
Daniel Dale annoys me. Thank you. Annoys me the least, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And it's because, he's not as awful as all the other examples you provided, where the so-called fact checkers clearly have a bias that's shining through in the way that they do fact checks on some politicians like Bernie Sanders versus others who lie and get away with it on a regular basis. Also, just the whole notion of fact checkers, the fact that that is a slice of what the news industry does is ridiculous. Journalism is supposed to be fact checking.
There shouldn't be these other people. Yeah. There shouldn't be these other people called fact check. But I mean, I guess it's
like Anderson Cooper's one segment, keeping him honest. It's oh, you're dedicating one segment to keeping him honest. It's just ridiculous. Anyway, go ahead.
No, I guess the final thing I'll say is or not, maybe not the final thing. Maybe we can say more. But the other thing I'll say is that there's a little bit of a kabuki performance to the whole thing that I find kind of too transparent for my taste. But the other thing is that this big thing you cited about calling Trump a liar, right? I mean, obviously Donald Trump's a liar, but so is Hillary Clinton, so is Joe Biden. They all lie. Politicians lie all the time, and it's like something that Adam Curtis says, like in some of his documentaries, where it's like politicians lie, the public knows, like understands that the politicians lie to them, the politicians know that the public knows that they are lying to them. Like it's just so this like big kind of breakthrough that they're calling Donald Trump a liar, it rings to, I think, the vast majority of people as like kind of hollow, given that they would never do that for Hillary Clinton. Like when Hillary Clinton says, I'm going to put working families first, like no one's going to call her a liar for saying that, but it's a lie. Like she would never do that. Never in her life has she ever put working families first, right? She's put other interests first, herself primarily, but also like, whoever, like, all her corporate masters kind of thing, so, and no fact checker is going to call that a lie, but it is. And everyone knows that. Wait, I lost your audio, Anna. I can't hear you.
I was just going to say, yeah, now I'm getting a little annoyed because we actually agree way more than I expected to. But yeah, look, you're absolutely right about that. It's selective fact checking. And let's also not forget that in many cases, and we've outlined some of them on this show, the media not only refuses to or fails to fact check certain politicians, it literally serves as stenographers for some of those lies. And so, or a lot of those lies, we talked about it in the context of foreign policy and how, the New York Times, for instance, just went ahead with the narrative from the OAS regarding Bolivia. And then later, very quietly did somewhat of an apology / retraction.
Whoopsie daisy. Yeah,
exactly. And so that kind of narrative led to a democratically elected leader basically getting run out of the position that he rightfully would have won, right? So, so I think that those criticisms are valid. I think that in the grand scheme of things and in the context of what we're seeing right now, Daniel Dale annoys me the least.
I don't mean to pick on
That's
Daniel
all I'm
Dale.
saying. Yeah, that's.
I'm sure he's a good guy. He seems like a good guy.
He seems nice.
He's a nice guy. But like his fact check on Trump, like making fun of Kamala / Kamala, and he's like, like when Trump's like, it drives you crazy, like it drives Kamala Harris is crazy when you, and he's like, no, it doesn't, like that's not a fact check. That's just not in any way, shape, or form like a legitimate fact check. I'm sorry, like you do not know for a fact that it does not drive her crazy. You just don't. I mean, there's no way to prove that. I mean, you have no idea what is like going on in her head. That is just not a journalistic fact, if that makes sense. Yeah, look, the protective nature, how protective they are of status quo politicians, I think gets under my skin the most, right? Like if you have even a little bit of a criticism or critique toward the Bidens or Kamala Harrises of the world, they get upset. And that's what annoys me, because I think there are valid criticisms. Just because they stay away from those critiques doesn't mean that Americans don't notice the failures and that other people who actually want to do their jobs appropriately shouldn't bring them up. And that's what we do on this show. Yeah. Well, should I do the Verso read, Anna? Do it. Yes. Okay, because this debate, just like everything else on this show, is brought to you by Verso Books. Now you can join the Verso Book Club and get every new ebook that Verso publishes each month, as well as one or more new books in the mail if you choose a print subscription. All Verso Book Club members will also get 50% off all books for as long as you are a subscriber. To celebrate their 50th anniversary and the launch of the book club, each member tier is 50% off for the first 3 months. The Comrade tier is now $20, and if you join in September, you'll get Climate Crisis and the Global Green New Deal, The Political Economy of Saving the Planet by Noam Chomsky and Robert Pollin, Glitch Feminism, a Manifesto by Legacy Russell, Corona, Climate, Chronic Emergency, War, Communism in the 21st Century by Andreas Malm, Care Manifesto, The Politics of Interdependence by the Care Collective, and a new edition of The Groundings with My Brothers by Walter Rodney. Plus, you'll get 8 additional ebooks. Nice. I love Verso it. Book Club. I love it. Yeah. And you're filling your shelves, That's true. Right now we see the guitars, but there we go. There they are. There we go. There they love are. It. I also have my Way to go. I gotta show you my Karl Marx
Love this.
It's my Karl Marx piggy bank. It says Das Kapital because you put all your capital in his head. So there you go, on my bookshelf.
I love it. I love it. All right. Well,
oh, there he's got the VI Lenin.
Look at you guys with your busts. I don't have any busts in this house.
We got to get you some busts, Anna.
I think busts are a little creepy. Like, I've always thought they were creepy, but it's okay. I fully support your decision to have busts in your homes. All right. Yeah. Well, let's talk about capital, and let's talk about people in positions of power and how they engage in destroying our society, but they get to launder their reputations through media by handing out pennies to people. So it's the truth. So what I'd like to talk about today is how willing and ready legacy media outlets are in engaging billionaires who have honestly contributed the most to inequality in this country, to pain and suffering in this country. But it doesn't matter to the legacy media outlets because they want to help these billionaires with their PR strategies, with laundering their images. And that certainly is the case when it comes to people like Jeff Bezos, who apparently is spending some of his money on this effort to build daycare centers or preschools for families who are living in poverty. Now, childcare, as we know, is incredibly expensive. And so let me just note that a lot of people choose to stay home rather than pay for childcare because it's so expensive. That lessens the workforce for people like Jeff Bezos. Let me just put that point out there. But he did post on Instagram, as you saw earlier, about this new classroom that he's opening up for preschool students. This classroom is just the beginning. The Bezos Academy opens its doors on October 19th. This one in Des Moines, Washington, is the first of many free preschools that will be opening for underserved children. Extra kudos to the team for fighting out how to make this happen even amidst COVID. So, this is the brave men and women who put this effort together and managed to succeed in funneling a tiny, tiny bit of Jeff Bezos's money toward this project. Wow, they're American heroes. But look, the issue with this is that when you look at the grand scheme of things, we need to tackle why so many people are living in poverty and why we would need some sort of charitable effort to help parents afford childcare for their kids or education for their kids. The problem isn't that we need more charitable actions as like the one that we're seeing right now from Jeff Bezos. The problem is Jeff Bezos fuels the economic situation in which so many people live in poverty and need to rely on the whims of billionaires in order to make ends meet. So Bezos and his Amazon Day Fund has apparently given $100 million to a variety of homeless-focused nonprofits. Again, this completely ignores the fact that inequality has contributed to homelessness in this country. This is one of the richest countries in the world, and we have a giant homeless population, 60,000 in Los Angeles alone. Amazon raised its wages of all of its employees to $15 an hour a few years ago, only after Bernie Sanders really put Jeff Bezos' feet to the fire and demanded that he raise wages. But keep in mind that even at this point, with a $15 per hour wage, depending on where you live, it's still not enough to make ends meet, even if you're living in a dual income household. So for instance, let's say you're a family of four, both parents working. What would you need to make in 2020 in Los Angeles, for instance, in order to make ends meet? That means to be able to pay for housing, for food, for education, for childcare, all of that stuff, to live somewhat comfortably. Well, in Los Angeles, you need to make $20.28. In New York, that number jumps up to $22.87. And in Seattle, the number is $29.75. Now, yes, I chose expensive areas in the country, some of these big cities, but that's part of the problem with talking about wages as if raising it to a certain amount is going to impact every American similarly. That's not the case. And $15 is still not considered a livable wage in many parts of this country, right? Many parts of this country where the jobs are. And so, you know, when you really think about how much effort it took to get Jeff Bezos just to raise wages to $15 an hour, I'm sorry, I'm just like not interested in giving him kudos because he opened a preschool for people living in poverty in one particular area of the country. How about you pay your taxes? You know, how about you do your part as an American who sucked up opportunities in this country, but refuses to help fund opportunities for other people. And so Bezos could just, you know, pay his workers more rather than toss the country a few pennies here or there as nothing more than a PR stunt. Again, I really want to emphasize that. And it would also be nice if his company paid its fair share of taxes. So for instance, Amazon told investors it paid a federal income tax rate of 1.2% last year. That's about 13 percentage points lower than the average American's tax rate paid in 2019. Even more striking, that was a 3-year high. That was a 3-year high for Amazon. Okay. So average Americans, working Americans, paid more in federal income taxes than Amazon did for several years. Let me give you more examples. 2019 was the first time Amazon reported paying taxes since 2016, and that's according to a recent financial filing with the SEC. Despite making billions in profits, Amazon showed federal tax refunds in 2017 and 2018. All told, the company reported $30.1 billion in profits, not revenue, profits in the US over the past 3 years. It also reported paying a negative $104 million to the IRS. Translation, Amazon received a 9-figure refund on its sizable earnings. Now, I get it. People are going to argue, well, I mean, this is how the tax system works. This is how tax code is written. Trump's tax cuts for the wealthy mean that Bezos and Amazon can take advantage of corporate tax loopholes. They get to pay a much lower rate. But again, this is the kind of system that people in positions of power, wealthy people like Jeff Bezos, lobby for. They fight aggressively. They contribute campaign donations to politicians who promise to either cut taxes or, in the case of Joe Biden, really refuse to do much about how unequal and unfair the tax system is right now. Bezos also is the first person on earth to be worth more than $200 billion. So this argument that, oh, well, he gave $100 million to this one project, and isn't he such a great guy? Let's write these glowing profiles about him. I'm not buying it, and I think it's pretty sick that it happens on a regular basis. So I want to give you some more examples. One of my favorite people, Robert Reich, wrote a great piece in The Guardian titled, America's billionaires are giving to charity, but much of it is self-serving rubbish. So in April, he wrote about the $100 million to food banks that was given by Jeff Bezos as part of his, charity. And what Reich writes is the amounts involved are tiny relative to the fortunes behind them. Bezos's $100 million, for example, amounts to 11 days of his income. Well-publicized philanthropy also conveniently distracts attention from how several of these billionaires are endangering their workers and, by extension, the public. Bezos still doesn't provide sick leave for workers unless they test positive for COVID-19, in which case they just get 2 weeks. On March 20th, 4 senators sent him a letter expressing concern that the company wasn't doing enough to protect its warehouse workers. And we also knew about, warehouse workers who immediately got fired once they tried to organize and do something about this. And finally, Reich doesn't just focus on Jeff Bezos. I know it seems like I'm just picking on Bezos, but there are multiple other examples. For instance, Walmart is a bit of an issue. Walmart engages in very similar activity. Bill Gates, if you can recall, got a lot of positive attention for his efforts in helping to fund a possible vaccine for coronavirus. And as was written in this piece, As Rupert Murdoch's Wall Street Journal editorial page put it, if we had a wealth tax like Elizabeth Warren proposed, it's unlikely Bill Gates would have the capacity to act this boldly. That's absurd. Warren's tax would have cost Gates about $6 billion a year, roughly his annual income from his $100 billion. So in other words, if we actually had a fair tax system, if we actually had a redistribution of wealth that made sense, if the wealthiest people in this country actually paid their fair share of taxes, it would contribute a lot more to society compared to, the relatively small amount they provide through these charitable organizations or these charitable efforts. And by the way, in 2018, for example, Jeff Bezos, the richest man in the world, and his other half, who he's now divorced from, gave about 1.5% of their total net worth, or $2 billion, to fund nonprofit schools and homeless charities through their Day One Fund. And of course, there are other ramifications to this. There are other stories that I think really miss the mark when it comes to how incredibly damaging this inequality is and how this system forces good people in this country to make unbelievably difficult decisions. And so I want to give you a recent example about a little boy named Blaze. Take a look.
This is Angela Farnan with baby Blaze. Blaze was born with a congenital heart defect. He had his first surgery at only 3 days old. Angela was on the team that took care of Blaze in the hospital for more than 6 months. She quickly became like family to the baby and his mother. Blaze had his second surgery at 8 months old, and that's when his mother asked this.
She made a heartfelt decision to ask us if we'd be willing to keep him on a permanent basis.
Angela and her husband said they fell in love with Blaze and knew immediately it was the right choice. They officially adopted Blaze this past summer.
So hat tip to TMBS. They covered this story in one of their post-game episodes, and you guys should become patrons of the show. It's excellent. But I bring it up because that story was covered as some heartwarming, awesome story. Like, oh my gosh, this nurse, what a great person. She decided to take on this incredibly important role in this little boy's life when his parents didn't have the means to afford his medical treatment. No, but the problem is the insane cost of medical treatment in this country. That's the problem. That's what the story is. And I'm not, trying to hate on the nurse. What the nurse did is kind, is sweet. She's a good person. She's not the issue here. But what the issue is how these types of problems get framed and repackaged as positives in the media. That is the problem. The problem is the root of the issue here. The fact that a family had to give up their own child because they could not afford healthcare for their child, right? But instead, the whole focus, all of the framing is on how there's this charitable act. Don't be hurt. Don't be angry about this insane, pathetic system. Just look at this heartwarming story and focus on that. Well, I refuse to do that, and we should hold media accountable when they cover stories this way. Because again, the real story is the inequality. It is this unjust, unfair system of redistributing wealth to the very top. And if anyone asks you about how you should feel about billionaires or how you should feel about these philanthropic stories, I really suggest that you take some, talking points or some leadership from someone who understands these issues well. Senator Bernie Sanders.
Who's your favorite billionaire in America?
I think Warren Buffett has said some decent things. When you have a billionaire who talks about raising taxes on the rich, I think he deserves some credit.
I'm not trying to coach your answers, but when you're on the show, you should say, well, Michael Bloomberg I like a lot. but Buffett's a good answer, too.
So one of my favorite tweets over this past week is from, someone who has a handle that I'm not even going to try to pronounce, but nonetheless, let's just take a look at what the tweet is because it's so on point. Every heartwarming human interest story in America is he raised $20,000 to keep 200 orphans from being crushed in the orphan crushing machine, and then never asks why an orphan crushing machine exists or why you'd need to pay to prevent it from being used. So we just need to be a little more critical about the framing of these philanthropic efforts, because it's really not about being charitable or being a good person or being philanthropic. It's all about laundering the reputations of people who have helped fund the effort of inequality in this country.
I mean, it's really crazy. I mean, I remember when Bill Gates did the Giving Pledge, and he committed to giving away like half of his wealth, and he kind of got other billionaires to sign on to the Giving Pledge, and this was seen as this like incredible thing and all that stuff. Bill Gates today is worth more than that day, the day he decided to give all his wealth away. It's like funny how that works. Like they give all their wealth away, but they somehow keep getting richer, because it's not so much about the dollar amount, it's about power. And when you have so much power, it's like the money just flows into you. You don't even have to do anything anymore. You know, like Bill Gates like doesn't really meaningfully work anymore, but he somehow still keeps on getting richer. And it's just it's really shocking. Like, I mean, someone like Bill Gates, you know, who nominally is giving away all his wealth. I mean, he obviously still controls it and uses it for what he wants. Namely, for the most part, his fanatical devotion to privatizing the public education system. And, you know, that shows just how problematic that idea is. This idea that billionaires just get to decide what to do with our collective resources, because it is our collective resources. We live, you know, not to get all jokerfied or anything, but we live in a society. And so it's all ours. And it's just impossible for regular small brain people like us, Anna, to really understand what even $1 billion is. Like, I think it's hard to wrap your mind around just how much money that is, like how wealthy those people are. There is no justification. Like there is no, even for 5 seconds, if you stop to think about, like, does anyone really deserve or need even $1 billion? Like no argument can be made that is in any way moral, especially in a world with so much hunger and deprivation and suffering, that one person would have over $1 billion to do what he pleases. I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And, you know, what it does to the country, right? Like this insane inequality. I just don't really understand it or get it. So, I mean, we both live in LA. We see the wealth in Los Angeles. There's no question. And I'm not in a bad area. You know, I'm in a pretty decent area. And I live in a little condo, but right on the next block, you start seeing these huge, like $5 million homes, but there are homeless people everywhere, right? Why would anyone want to live like that? Right? Like, let's say you don't care about humanity at all. You only care about your own comfort, your own self-interest, right? I mean, I think that that's wrong, and you should want to live in a society that takes care of everyone. But let's say you're the most selfish, you know, person on the planet, and you don't care about people in poverty. Okay, if you only care about yourself, do you want to live in a situation where there's human excrement on the sidewalk every day because people don't have homes? Do you? I don't want to live in a situation like that. I just don't get it. I don't get where their head's at. I don't get why they need to accumulate this much wealth. I think you're right that power has a lot to do with it. But this type of greed is tearing the country apart. And the media has either been complicit in it or has aided and abetted this system over and over again.
Yeah. And I think that, you know, the conservative riposte to the left critique of inequality is that, like, why do you care about inequality if, you know, everyone else is kind of going up? You know, that's the Steven Pinker argument, is that, you know, inequality doesn't matter. What you have to look at is kind of like total outcomes, and if you look at the trends, like, you know, kind of it's going up, and like that's just problematic. But on its own terms, but inequality in and of itself is a corrosive influence on society. It doesn't matter if it's like billionaires versus, you know, people making $4 an hour plus tips in restaurants or whatever. But it's like if you take that, you just change the dollar amounts but make the difference the same, and the amount of people that control the sort of amount of wealth the same, the corrosive influence on the society and on the politics because it is at the end of the day about power, not about the amount of money they have. Because they have so much power, that creates a sense of powerlessness from the rest of the society, which has all the troublesome things that we're witnessing in our society today, which is cynicism, apathy, deaths of despair. All that comes from a sense of not having a stake in your own life, that there's these forces bigger than you, mainly billionaires, just kind of controlling everything, and you really don't have a say. You can kind of kick and scream about it and get mad about stuff, but you really don't have anything to do about it. And so that is in and of itself the problem with inequality. It's not so much the dollar amount. I mean, the dollar amount is a problem also, but it's really about power.
Yeah, it undermines what we've been told this country cares so much about, which is democracy, the democratic process. It creates an entire class of powerless people. And yeah, it's an unstable situation to function under, and we're seeing the outcome of that right now. I mean, I know that a lot of these protests out on the street, of course, have to do with police brutality, but at the heart of it is, how poverty plays a role in all of this. Yeah. How brutal policing takes place in the most impoverished neighborhoods in this country. So, there's certainly some reckoning that people who support and protect this system have to deal with, but they're just so defiant and resistant. It's pretty unbearable.
The mere presence of inequality is proof enough that we don't really live in a democracy. Democracy and inequality is completely at odds. Like it's like a literal impossibility. If you have democracy, you cannot have inequality, because the presence of if there was a democracy, the majority of the people would just use their democratic rights, exercise their democratic rights to redistribute wealth to themselves. Like, why wouldn't they? If they had the power to do it, they would do it. So the mere presence of inequality, the mere fact that there are 40 million people living in poverty in the United States, that there are 40 million people in the United States suffering from something called food insecurity, which is just hunger. And that is coupled with the presence of more billionaires than any country in the history of the world, is mere proof that the United States does not live in a real democracy. I mean, we have certain democratic rights here and there. We have a fairly open society in many ways, but we don't have true democracy, because true democracy is completely anathema to inequality. Logically, it just doesn't make any sense. So, yeah.
All right.
Alrighty.
Well, you got your own commentary segment, which I can't wait to hear.
All righty. Well, Anna, this week I wanted to do something that I promised myself I would never do, which is take down a viral #resistance Twitter thread. And I know what you're thinking, people at home. Owning the libs? Come on, that's so easy. It's a cheap shot. But this one comes from a very specific liberal, and it's one who I find myself generally respecting more than 99% of other liberals, MSNBC's very own Chris Hayes. And Chris Hayes is a really good guy, and he seems like a really good guy, and he's actually pretty smart. I mean, he started his career on what could be called the far left of the American political spectrum of the early aughts. He was writing really sharp pieces for magazines like In These Times and The Nation, which are pretty on the extreme left, especially like in that era where there was no Jacobin, for example. But as the 2010s rolled around, Chris started getting work hosting on MSNBC. And since then, his politics have become much more mainstream liberal. And this week, he had a viral Twitter thread in which he gleefully punched to his left. And I think it's worth taking a look at. It started, quote, "For the first 3 or so years of Trump's term, there was a certain mode of analysis fairly common among self-styled savvy centrists, #resistance-averse leftists, and tons of conservatives that basically held that everyone freaking out about Trump was being overwrought and hysterical." Chris expounded on the point. The argument went, look, yes, he's a jerk and says crazy stuff, but the country is basically not that changed. Unemployment is low. Daily life continues as normal. There aren't tanks in the streets. You libs have lost your minds, obsessing over Russia and each new scandal, etc. This, my friends, is the world's biggest straw man. Chris is trying to play into the liberal horseshoe theory that the right and the left are basically the same, and that only they, the liberals, are right. But to say that the left believes that everything was fine under Trump because unemployment was low and that daily life continues as normal is disingenuous at best. The left argument has always been that even under the good liberal Obama, the status quo in America was a daily moral catastrophe, given that millions lived in poverty, millions were uninsured, hundreds of thousands lived on the streets, and the American war machine kept murdering people abroad. And Hayes is making a common liberal mistake, namely seeing Trump as the cause of daily misery in America, whereas the left sees Trump more as a symptom of the daily misery in America. Misery that the Democrats did almost nothing to ameliorate when they were in power under Obama. But Chris continued, now look where we are. There are 205,000 dead Americans and 1,000 more every day. 7 million have been sickened, tens of millions out of work. His own task force staffer has come forward to say he does not care about those deaths and thinks his own supporters are disgusting. Yes, all of those things are very bad. But under the liberal status quo with Obamacare, 30,000 people died unnecessarily every year because they lacked health insurance. And yes, those numbers have increased unacceptably under the pandemic, but the pandemic today is worse than it could have been had liberals passed, say, Medicare for all. But Chris reminds us, Trump has done many, many bad things, like separating children from their parents at the border. Now, of course, this is an absolutely horrifying thing, but it is also true that under Obama, more people were deported than in any other administration in history. And to the left, like people like me, the destruction of millions of lives by physically removing them from their homes was and is unacceptable. But to liberals, it was cool when their guy did it. Extend this logic to anything else you like, say the drone war or climate policy. I always remind people that the Standing Rock protests were under Obama. And the reason why the left is averse to the hashtag resistance liberals is because their reaction to Trump goes one of two ways. The first is to hysterically scream over some superficial norm that Trump broke, while then voting to give him more power. This became crystal clear when the Democrats were voting to impeach Trump, a totally empty gesture that they knew would do literally nothing, given that the Senate is controlled by the Republicans and they would never get rid of their own guy, while at the same time, the same exact time, voting to increase Trump's military budget by $738 billion. Now, of course, you don't hear much about this on MSNBC. MSNBC will have an absolute meltdown and give round-the-clock coverage when some random Russian guy emails Don Jr. to say something like, hey, wouldn't it be cool if Hillary Clinton were in jail? But when a dangerous madman like Trump gets more power, not a peep. The second tack that resistance liberals do to oppose Trump that drives the left crazy is that they oppose Trump from the right. Just 2 days ago, Joe Biden tweeted this: En el Día de la Virgen de las Mercedes, acompaño en solidaridad a todos los defensores de derechos humanos de Cuba, Nicaragua y Venezuela, y rezo por la liberación de todos los presos políticos. Wow, I almost wept. And back in May, Joe Biden tweeted this: Trump's international failures have cleared a path for Cuba to join the UN Human Rights Council. The horror, the horror. This would betray Cuba's political prisoners and further undermine U.S. diplomacy. As president, I will lead by empowering the Cuban people and defending human rights. So apparently, to the liberals, Trump, whose administration likely participated in the hilarious Bay of Piglets coup attempt in Venezuela, which was this year, by the way, whose administration rolled back the Obama-era détente with Cuba, including a fresh round of sanctions just this week, is actually not hawkish enough on Cuba and Venezuela. But of course, the most glaring example of this is with the liberal obsession on fighting a new Cold War with Russia. And for that, Chris Hayes and his network MSNBC deserve a whole lot of blame. Of course, Obama famously and rightly advocated for an easing of tensions with Russia.
Governor Romney, I'm glad that you recognize that al-Qaeda is a threat, because a few months ago, when you were asked what's the biggest geopolitical threat facing America, you said Russia. Not al-Qaeda, you said Russia. In the 1980s are now calling to ask for their foreign policy back.
But all of that has gone out the window in the last 4 years under Trump. And again, liberals do this thing where they only see above the surface. They go apoplectic when Trump says something nice about Putin, but then ignore the fact that, for example, in June of this year, Trump sent 1,000 more American troops to Poland to, quote, bolster NATO's eastern flank against Russian aggression. I mean, that's just an incredibly aggressive move. Imagine what U.S. policymakers would do if Russia sent 1,000 troops to Mexico. But of course, none of that is discussed. Instead, Chris Hayes, who back in 2008, when he was at The Nation, praised something called the Pundit Accountability Project as something that was, quote, long overdue, gave favorable airtime on his own show to the absolutely bonkers, insane, 1,000% fake news Jonathan Chait assertion that Trump has been a Russian intelligence asset since 1987.
Did the Trump campaign, did the candidate at the heart of it conspire with Russia to subvert American democracy? And does Russia have some kind of leverage over Donald Trump? In a new cover story from New York Magazine, writer Jonathan Chait argues we have not allowed ourselves to consider the full range of possibilities. Chait lays out what could be considered the worst-case scenario for Trump-Russia collusion, that Donald Trump has been a Russian intelligence asset since 1987.
Yeah, I just want to take a pause here and really underscore what is seriously being discussed in this cable news segment, which is based on a cover story in New York Mag, one of the 3 or 4 most prominent liberal magazines, that Donald Trump has been essentially a Russian spy since 1987. I mean, 1987, not to mention the fact that the Soviet Union was still around back then, but Trump himself was a real estate goon trying to get with Heather Locklear at the Vanity Fair Christmas party, only to turn her down because she was very nasty to him or whatever. But let's continue with the segment.
Everyone always says, well, this has been Trump's view forever. All this stuff he's saying about the Western allies splitting us apart from the West and how he's sort of pissing on them all the time and saying, we should let them go their own way. That's just what he's always thought. It's not really what he's always thought. It's what he's thought since 1987. He never thought that before then, or at least he never said it before then. And in 1987 is when he went to Moscow and he's feted by the Russians and tours Moscow. And then he comes back. Then he starts talking about running for president for the first time, and then he starts talking for the first time about how our allies are a bunch of freeloaders and we should kick them to the curb.
Yeah, and we should say that he is, I just want to be clear here, he is really consistent on that point, right? The idea that this sort of zero-sum view that our allies are free-riding and we're paying for it, he takes out full-page ads at $100,000. He sounds identical to how he does now, right? The idea that, like, we're getting abused, we're getting taken for granted, and we're paying for other people's defense.
We're paying for other people's defense who were defending against the Russians.
Right, at that point particularly, yes.
So it really dovetails with Russian foreign policy interests then and now.
I can't stress just how irresponsible this kind of thing is. Who watches cable news, right? Boomers. And think about your own boomer mother and father. They came up in an age where if the TV man said it, it must be true. Certainly, both of my parents are like that. If the man on the TV says something, it's because it's probably true. But of course, this is not true. The central claims of Russiagate that MSNBC and Chris Hayes have been pushing for years have all fallen apart. The P-tape is not real. The compromat does not exist. Trump has not been a Russian spy since 1987. Robert Mueller exited our lives as quickly as he entered them, having done literally nothing. But Russiagate was the central plank of the liberal opposition to Trump. Not the horrifying policies that harmed actual people, not the gutting of what little was left of the environmental protections, not the anti-labor fanatics he's appointed to the National Labor Relations Board, as Paul Prescott outlined this week in Jacobin. Everyone go ahead and read that. But most of all, the liberals don't understand that Trump can only exist because of decades of the failure of liberal governance. This was something that Chris Hayes himself once wrote about quite eloquently in his 2012 book, Twilight of the Elites, where he described the sequences of bipartisan failures from the late 90s through the aughts with things like Enron, the Catholic Church abuse, the Iraq War, and the financial crisis, and how those failures corroded our society and our democracy. But here's Chris in 2020, concluding his viral thread with this stirring call to arms. And yet, you still see the savvy arm's-length mode of analysis across the spectrum. Oh, calm down, libs. Is it really so bad? More Americans have died in the last 6 months than during any 6-month period in 100 years. Yes, it's that bad. Wake the hell up. Yes, it is that bad, but this is not new. It's been bad. And yes, the Republicans and Trump are evil and have always been evil and will always be evil. But liberals and the Democratic Party have been complicit in that as well. Wake the hell up. That's all I got.
You raised a lot of really great points. You raised a lot of good points, and I loved how comprehensive you were. There is one area where I think I agree a little bit with Chris Hayes and disagree with some of the narrative coming from the left, right? I agree. Liberals have paved the way for Trump, and you gave perfect examples of that. And I do think that what we see from mainstream media is this, like, this need to make Trump out to be like incredibly unique in his awfulness, while completely ignoring some of the similar actions that took place prior to Trump, getting elected into office. The one thing that I think the left can do a little better on is I think they like kind of stop at, well, things were bad before, right? And they don't really give any credibility to some of the very specific ways in which Trump is worse, right? So Trump really does rely on dividing the country in like the worst possible way. And I'm sure other presidents have done that, but not to the same extent. Like Trump wittingly, intentionally wants Americans to hate each other, to fight each other. We have paramilitary groups in the country now going around murdering people, and you have the right wing justifying those murders. You also have the expiration of the consent decree that would prevent Republicans from sending armed law enforcement to in-person polling locations, with the effort to intimidate voters. Well, that consent decree has expired, and what did Republicans do? What did the Trump campaign do? They immediately hired 50,000 armed people to show up to in-person voting locations throughout the country. So, I think that the left makes so many great points, but in order to really make those points in a credible way, they also need to acknowledge some of the very specific ways in which Trump is particularly awful.
No,
you get what I'm saying?
I mean, and I think that what Trump in that kind of cuts both ways with Trump, in that it's very clarifying, in that he it's like a mask off situation. It's like, we're not even pretending anymore. We're not doing the kabuki theater anymore. We're just kind of saying the thing that we really mean. Like George W. Bush was very skilled at the sort of rhetorical kind of outreaches to people, even like in the wake of 9/11, to like people like Muslims and stuff like that. Like he didn't do, like, imagine if Trump was like after 9/11, he would be like, all the Muslims, we just kill them all, whereas George Bush like understood that rhetorically he had to kind of make that claim to be the president of the whole country. George Bush was also famously very kind of rhetorically positive towards Hispanics. He did not seek to divide the country, especially along racial lines, the way Trump explicitly does time and time again. And of course, that's very, very, very bad. But I think that in general, the reason why I feel like I need to push back on the sort of liberal critiques of Trump that are almost purely superficial, like rarely do they have to do with like concrete policies, which is, and the proof of that is the liberal nostalgia for George Bush.
I know.
Because he knew how to play the game, a little bit better.
Yep.
I mean, at the time they thought he was ridiculous, but now there's like this kind of nostalgia, even though George Bush, like from a concrete policy standpoint, like if we're like counting bodies, like this is he started the Iraq War, like the greatest crime probably in 30, 40 years in world history.
And every president, has further expanded upon that type of foreign policy. Like Obama did that. He expanded upon, drone strikes and things like that. And then, it paves the way for someone like Trump to come into office. And Trump has already surpassed drone strikes compared to the Obama administration.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's the thing. Like, I think that is a completely accurate description of how this all went down. I think part of my issue, and I think where I agree with Chris Hayes a little bit, is the left will criticize Obama for his drone policy, but then they just kind of stop there and kind of refuse to acknowledge that Trump has taken that policy and put it on steroids. Like, the criticism does also need to extend to Trump. And I think sometimes the way that the left comes off, and I don't think they intentionally do this, I think it's a problem with messaging. Sometimes because the left wants to contextualize things and explain things in a much more robust, detailed way, sometimes they forget to finish the explanation by, ending with what Trump is able to do and how he's able to take these awful policies and go even further because liberals have paved the way. You get what I'm saying?
No, totally. And, I think that the sort of tactical debate that can be had for that is that, I think many people on the left kind of instinctively feel that their immediate political goal needs to be some sort of takeover of the Democratic Party, that without that, we're just going to see further and further devolvement of the country into this kind of like right-wing hell state. That without sort of being able to take over the only opposition party, that they're hopeless to stop that. So, what are we going to do if we have to like kind of get between? They're standing in between us and fighting the right.
Yeah, you're right. You're right.
And until we can do that, we can't be in the position to really like fight the right. Like if we're ceding that fight to liberals right now because they're the ones in the positions of power in the sort of opposition, they're never going to be able to do it. They're just not going to be able to do it. So kind of the immediate goal of the left should be in some way, a defeat of the current iteration of the Democratic Party, if that makes sense. And there's all kinds of tactical issues that come up with that, namely whether like it's better for Biden or Trump to win on that narrow tactical ground, right? Like I happen to believe we're probably better off with Biden in there than with Trump, but there is tactical questions, right? But I think that rhetorical that the right's going to think we're like they look to the left and see this like undifferentiated mass of like Maoists or something. It doesn't matter like to them what it doesn't make a huge difference to them like if the criticisms are from libs or from leftists. Like it's the real kind of goal is liberals. I mean, I at least that's how I can understand it.
Yeah, I say this often, especially after what we've experienced with these resistance members of Congress. We need to know our enemies, and you're absolutely right. Our biggest enemies right now are these neoliberal lawmakers and people like Nancy Pelosi. I wrote a piece for The Hill that listed all the different ways in which Nancy Pelosi has actually aided and abetted Donald Trump. And of course, heads exploded. People came after me on Twitter. I don't care because I show my work and the evidence is there. Literally on the same day that Congress, the House is listing the impeachment charges against Donald Trump, Nancy Pelosi does a press conference where she's like, would you look at that? We worked with Donald Trump to pass his rebranded version of NAFTA. Isn't he so great? Like, what are you doing? What are you doing? So anyway, I think, I love the way you tackled that. I think your response to Chris Hayes is on the mark. And I saw a lot of outrage toward what he had to tweet in that thread. And I was really hoping that someone would address it in a comprehensive way like you did. So thank you.
Glad I could help.
All right. Well, we have our interview next, and it's very topical. We're going to talk about the Supreme Court with Samuel Moyn. He's a professor of jurisprudence and a professor of law at Yale. Sam, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Nice to be with you.
Wait, Yale is one of the good ones, right?
I hope there are some good apples in some of these barrels.
So I'll start off with what's currently happening with the Supreme Court and how Donald Trump is very likely to choose Amy Coney Barrett as his Supreme Court nominee. And so there have been a bunch of reports about what Congress can do, specifically what Democrats can do to try to, utilize procedural rules to prevent this vote from happening. But when I look at it carefully, it doesn't really seem like these procedural tactics are gonna work. And so I wanted to get your take on that.
I think you're right. It's clear now that Donald Trump's going to announce Amy Coney Barrett as his nominee in a little under 3 hours. She's left South Bend and is flying to Washington as we speak. It's almost unthinkable that the Democrats can stop the train that not so much Trump, but Mitch McConnell has started towards its inevitable destination. Once the filibuster was eliminated for judicial appointments and then for Supreme Court confirmations, it just takes 50 votes, and there are various procedural votes, like the vote to calling for cloture. But as long as McConnell keeps his caucus together, and it seems like he has over 50, won't even need Mike Pence's vice presidential vote to break a tie, he can overcome all of those hurdles. So, we're going to have a big national debate now about Judge Barrett, but I think it'd be better to step back and think about what the left, including liberals, should think about the Supreme Court and this repetitious, psychodrama we have whenever it's time to replace a justice.
Yeah, and I want to kind of ask about that, because I think that this one is going to be so traumatic to a lot of liberals that some of them are even seriously talking about even things that are like court packing, which would have been unthinkable like 20 years ago. Like, what's your general take on that?
Well, so there are a couple of things that are happening, with generational change, this show, so many other, amazing contributions. The left is rising, and Mitch McConnell knows it. The liberals have maintained this kind of waning faith in a centrist or neutral Supreme Court, but it's not been credible for many years. But at least as long as Chief Justice John Roberts switched sides once in a while, or another justice surprised them, they could always come back and live in the illusion. But this appointment will make for 6 conservatives, and there are just going to be many more bad decisions for liberals. The background, though, is that you just discussed this. A lot of people are going to vote for Joe Biden, and it looks like McConnell is making an enormous bet. He might lose Senate control, including his own seat. But as Thomas Jefferson, remarked back at the beginning, when there were elites challenged by the people, the elites, as he said, could flee into the judiciary as into a stronghold. And it seems as if McConnell wants to establish generational control over this incredibly powerful branch of government. And if he does, it matters a lot less if he loses, if Donald Trump loses in November, just because the judiciary is so powerful in our national life to our detriment.
Okay, so let's talk about that a little bit, because Americans have been sold this idea that we have this wonderful system of checks and balances. You have these equal branches of government that carry out these checks and balances. But it appears as though the judicial branch has accumulated much more power and has created or made for this seemingly undemocratic system. At least that's the way I see it. So I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on that and how it came to be that the judicial branch became so powerful.
Well, I took civics, and, I went to American high school, and I learned with all of my classmates and fellow Americans that without a judiciary that's effectively empowered, especially to defend constitutional rights, you'd have tyranny of the majority, if not outright totalitarianism. And it's really what distinguishes America from all the bad countries. And it is true that America has a much more powerful judiciary than any even liberal democracy. Now, the truth is that the founders back in the day set up a range of elite institutions to make sure that the people didn't rule. And we're very familiar now with the Electoral College and indeed the Senate, which shifts so much power away from majorities. But the judiciary, especially the power of judicial review, the power that judges really took, because it's not in the Constitution, to invalidate federal legislation, was also part of the protection of the perquisites of the wealthy and powerful. And, this was most glaring before the Civil War, when it was a court that in Dred Scott and Prigby, Pennsylvania, many other cases, defended the slaveholding order, went far, further than they needed to. But it became most glaring after the Civil War, with the rise of, the Gilded Age. And there, the federal judiciary was often in the pocket of the wealthy, defending what they called freedom of contract against rising workers' movements, and call for, regulation of bargains between labor and capital, regulations, making sure children didn't work, limitations to working hours, and so forth and so on. Franklin Roosevelt had to face down the judiciary to overcome that really 50-year resistance that, in the name of the Constitution, the judiciary posed to popular legislation. And it seems like we're heading into another such period. Really, the court has been, centrist on the best of days, reactionary most others, for a number of decades, contributing nothing to racial justice, neoliberal in its jurisprudence, ignoring class, ignoring structural justice. There was, liberals will say, a period in between FDR and us, the Earl Warren's court, in which it was this priceless institution, which shows we can't do without it. But, I and many others firmly believe that it's a good thing that we're seeing that the judiciary needs to be faced down. If Biden wins, if in some, future we can imagine AOC or some others want to pass a powerful HR1 or a Green New Deal, there will be another confrontation with the Supreme Court. And we have to decide, what do we do? What are our options in that case?
Yeah, and I want to discuss some of those options, because in a piece in an interview with Jacobin, you wrote that the historic left project, which some of us have been trying to revive, was always to disempower the court. Socialists in the early 20th century denounced the court for its defense of laissez-faire capitalism, and the left originated a ton of reform proposals. You mentioned how judicial review is not in the Constitution, that the court just kind of asserted that right at one point, and people just kind of accepted it. I know Matt Brunig has been talking a lot about just if a president could, in theory, just ignore the court if they outlawed a lot. What are some of the reform proposals? Would that be too drastic, or what are your thoughts? Like, how should the left disempower the court?
So, it would be quite feasible if a president and Congress, backed by a popular movement, just had the backing. There's no in particular reason the political branches and with the confidence of a political movement couldn't ignore the court. That what the court says isn't self-enforcing. Most of us are operating in a universe where we want to, figure out what the right, what the right form of the judiciary is. We'll always need, even, a socialist government will need judges to interpret and enforce their laws. And so certainly you can't ignore if you can maintain a coalition, because it will freak a lot of people out. But sooner or later you need to have a constructive program. And there are really two. There are two other alternatives beyond just ignoring the court. One is court packing, which a lot of people have had on the brain really since Mitch McConnell ignored Barack Obama's last nomination, and eventually, once Trump was elected, put Neil Gorsuch on the court. And it's basically Franklin Roosevelt's old solution. It didn't go through in 1937 when Franklin Roosevelt proposed it, but it's like burned in our memory. And a lot of folks want to get the court back by putting some liberal justices on the bench to kind of counteract and negate the ones that Trump has gotten up there. The trouble is that the baseline sucked. And the baseline of the power the court exercises is intolerable. So getting some liberals up there, it might lead to better results from case to case, but not in the long term, because you haven't really thought about, design. How do we design a democracy in which we don't shunt so much power to a council of elders to kind of censor our laws? So that's where we get into other proposals than court packing. And, I'm not advocating one, but I'm just arguing that we need to look at reforms that just make the court less powerful. Like most courts, most places on earth that have a role, but don't have the role that they've been given in the United States, which is basically to rewrite the law, sometimes on behalf of the wealthy and powerful. So examples would include, if Congress passes an exciting law like H.R. 1 or the Green New Deal bill, it could include in the law a provision that it can't be challenged in the federal courts. We could also kind of more creatively try to insist that the Supreme Court decide a certain number of cases under a supermajority rule. Right now, 5 people can invalidate Obamacare or big parts of it. And, actually, because it's because of Ruth Ginsburg's death, the whole law may fall now for reasons we can get into. If you had like a 7-2 or 8-1 or even a unanimity requirement, maybe you say when that many judges of different ideological stripes can agree that a law is noxious, maybe we ought to preserve their role. But when it's 5-4 or 6-3, as some cases are going to be now, just because there are 6 conservatives, we shouldn't allow that censorship to take place.
That supermajority argument is really interesting, and I haven't heard a lot of people make it. Is that something that's really been discussed seriously? Because, of course, I've heard a lot about packing the courts. Ro Khanna, for instance, Congressman Ro Khanna, he's proposed term limits, 18 years, rather than allowing people to have these lifelong, roles in the Supreme Court. Has anyone considered maybe changing the way these decisions are handed down by focusing more on a supermajority as opposed to a simple majority?
Absolutely. The remedies I'm discussing, which are, let's call them the disempowering remedies, are actually the ones that the socialists devised and argued for in, the 1920s and 30s. It's kind of confusing why court packing would have become so prominent, but for the fact that it's just so famous in the history of the Democratic Party. Term limits don't do a lot, especially if they're prospective, because basically they grandfather in all the judges who have already been appointed, including many Supreme Court justices who've already outlived their welcome. And with a lot of these folks, if you started them on an 18-year clock, well, that's almost as bad as what we've got now. It'd be fine if you said, Amy Coney Barrett can only serve 18 years, but consider the damage that the Supreme Court is going to do in that period. So term limits is like, has made the rounds in the past 25 years, partly because it's so weak a remedy. Court packing has been talked about, really recently, and it's gained traction. And some of us want to, kind of dredge out these older, we think better solutions. Now, note you could use them in tandem. I mean, I think it's almost certain that if Biden wins and the Senate changes hands, there will be some kind of court packing. It'll probably be modest because Biden is modest. He's actually condemned court packing. But if Amy Coney Barrett gets up there, I can't imagine that there won't be a lot of people who want to add 2 seats to the Supreme Court, but that doesn't mean you can't disempower the institution too, because you have not just short run goals, but long run goals. And again, putting 2 people up there who are Democrats kind of creates the status quo anti-Gorsuch, but it was already terrible. And you know, the court's been the most business friendly court in 100 years, and that's been for decades. You know, many of the justices we look up to, like Ruth Ginsburg and Elena Kagan, liberals, have been part of that, if you like, neoliberal bench. And so I think progressives, the left, have to hold out for more ambitious results than just going back to the old corruption.
You've mentioned the FDR court packing episode a couple times, and it's such it's so ingrained in the liberal conventional wisdom that when FDR attempted the court packing, it was just this like hubristic overreach. It was an unmitigated disaster. Don't ever try that again. Even FDR, the greatest man, to ever do the presidency, couldn't pull it off. Don't touch the court. It's like kryptonite. Is that an accurate read of the history of what happened in the 1930s with FDR, the sort of conventional wisdom that, this was just kind of, something that you should never touch again?
No. It's true that in the end, the Congress refused to approve FDR's court packing plan, but it was an incredibly, contingent thing, near miss. An Arkansas senator named Joseph Robinson dropped dead a couple of days before the vote, and that meant it didn't come to pass. But actually, even by that time, in the summer of 1937, the court had shifted. So a lot of the talk around these reforms is well meant by people like me, but a lot of others may want to treat all of this talk as creating a credible threat for the justices in hopes that they will move a little bit. My trouble with that is that Roberts already does move on occasion. What he mostly cares about, aside from right-wing results, is the institutional standing of the Supreme Court. And the fact that he changes sides in a couple of cases leaves the overall output of the Supreme Court still totally unacceptable. And there's also this kind of deeper political question. Even if they get to some right answers on occasion, do we want to shift democratic power to this Council of Elders? Congress has really abandoned its role in our lifetimes because it's been able to get judges to do its dirty work. And that's just not democracy as I understand it, and I hope a lot of others. So court packing could work. No reason why not, especially if it's a modest plan. And it could also work as a threat that lead the justices, as happened in the 1930s, to change their tune. The justice had condemned the New Deal before 1937 and then approved it and said it was compatible with the Constitution. So that was understood to be a huge win. And Roosevelt, in a brilliant address on Constitution Day in fall 1937, took a victory lap. If you want to read one document about kind of, what the left should think about the Supreme Court, read it. It's online. In it, he says, we should care about the tyranny of the minority backed up by the Supreme Court, not just the tyranny of the majority against minorities. So I think we're back in a situation. Maybe court packing has a role, but even if it does, if we don't disempower the court, it'll come back to haunt us.
I love the point that you're making about Congress basically allowing for the Supreme Court to do its dirty work. I think that's part of the reason why you see Congress enjoy such a low approval rating. But, one of the things that really stood out to me, it was a recent Twitter thread you put out. I don't know if it was in the context of the Supreme Court issue, but you were talking about some of the hyperbolic language that exists out there and how it does disempower people, could disempower people and convince them that their participation in our electoral process, for instance, isn't worth it, or the activism and organizing isn't worth it. So I agree with you on that point. But at the same time, it's really interesting to see what the hyperbolic language focuses on when it comes to the Supreme Court. A lot of it is about what's going to happen to reproductive rights. And to be fair, I think that's a legitimate concern, especially with Amy Coney Barrett's, past statements about reproductive rights and things like that. However, the issue that comes up over and over again with the Supreme Court, even without Amy Coney Barrett's participation in the Supreme Court, is how often the Supreme Court protects corporate interests. And so what I'm actually much more worried about, what I think is more likely to happen, and maybe I'm being naive on the reproductive rights issue, is that they're going to strike down the Affordable Care Act, and Americans with pre-existing conditions have no protections at all. So can you just weigh in on that a little bit? Because I just think that that's more of a threat, and there's virtually no hyperbolic language on that.
Yeah, no, great question. That tweet storm that you're citing was not about the Supreme Court. It was actually about kind of the fears of a coup now on election day that have kind of haunted a lot of folks really since the day Donald Trump was elected the first time. And I'm not going to defend Chris Hayes from Nando's onslaught, but he did retweet and agree with my little tweet storm.
There you go.
You're raising kind of another set of issues. There's no doubt the Supreme Court has done some good things, and Brown v. Board of Education is at the top of the list. Roe v. Wade is a great feminist breakthrough. But there are a couple of things. First, we don't give out Uzis just because there are imaginable situation in which someone uses an Uzi for a good cause, and those results, maybe should have been achieved in another way, especially since now, to a startling extent, the public schools are resegregated. And the abortion right, where popular majorities don't want it, namely the U.S. South, is almost unavailable practically. Now, that's not to say that, the death of Roe v. Wade wouldn't be a terrible thing and wouldn't have the outrageous consequences that a lot of people associate with it. On the other hand, if we don't convince our fellow citizens to share our values, and get judges in a kind of shortcut or quick fix, impose them on high, it could be that there's more alienation from the values we want to propagate rather than more acceptance. And as you say, against the modicum of good that the Supreme Court really achieved for a pretty brief period in the 1950s and 60s, we've got just the barrage of outrageous, horror that they've inflicted, whether it's letting the executive do what he wants long before Donald Trump's travel ban. The Supreme Court has never set right the presidentialism in war. And then in business and, really the social contract, many constitutions have economic and social rights like, health and housing. Ours doesn't. The judges would never find it, would not be able to enforce it. And it's true that because of Ginsburg's death and absence, if John Roberts chooses to let Obamacare die after, personally salvaging one piece of it a few years ago, it will be off the books. So, my conclusion is that if we have a program, that the liberals and the left can get behind, the left pushing the liberals as much as they can, it should be enacted via the legislature and not let the judges, obstruct it, because we've been living with that for really decades now. Obamacare is an excellent example. Why?
Yeah, the court is not your friend. Just switching gears for the last question really quickly a little bit. It is related to the court, but you've written a lot in the past about how human rights or the modern conception of human rights have been kind of a neoliberal construction that avoids issues of class and issues of exploitation and domination. And one of the common arguments you hear in favor of the court is that it sort of protects the human rights of the minority against the tyranny of the majority. Like if, I don't know, if maybe like the 50+1% of the country wanted to vote to make gay people illegal or something. In a different framework in which there was, not this kind of current version of the court, a disempowered court as you're advocating, how would that work?
Well, it's true that to the extent we disempower, counter-majoritarian forces, we have to get the majority to advocate, moral policies. But that's already true. And in exchange for creating this insurance system against, the excesses of majorities, actually, the court has helped the wrong minorities. So it's undoubtedly true that the court has played a big role in let's call it, in Marxian terms, formal emancipation. It's made African Americans equal on paper. It's made women and more recently homosexuals equal on paper, including giving them the right to marry same sex. And yet it's all done in a class-free way that undermines the very equality that it's intended to promote. And on the other side of the ledger, it's reinventing all of the rights that in the abstract we do care about to favor the powerful few. Free speech, which we think would die absent a powerful court, has been perverted into a protection of the wealthy in cases like Citizens United, into a union-busting principle in a case like Janus. Freedom of religion, which we can debate, has been interpreted by the current Supreme Court as a device to limit the sway of anti-discrimination law in cases like Masterpiece Cake Shop. So what you get is formal equality with the one hand and, neoliberalism and reaction with the other. And neither one is contributing to structural equality. So that's on us. And, we create our political world. And I think we should have learned by now that, asking our grandparents to kind of keep us honest is not the way to go. They're not going to help us, and they will hurt us.
All right. Samuel Moyn, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us, to have this thoughtful conversation. I hope you'll come back soon.
Oh, anytime. Nice to meet you all.
All right. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we've got some salt for you guys. Hey guys, welcome back. Took a little break. I really love that interview. That was the most thoughtful conversation I've had on the Supreme Court. You know, just keeping it real, not fear-mongering in any way, little historical context. It's not a big deal. It's what we do here at Jacobin. Nando, are you muted? You might be muted.
Sorry. What I like about
there we go.
Samuel is that he, like a lot of these conversations around the Supreme Court exist on the kind of theoretical plane. You know, they're always kind of like thought exercises and theoretical exercises.
Yeah.
Like Samuel evaluates the court as an actually existing thing and just looks at, okay, no, this is what they've done. It doesn't matter, like in theory, what they're supposed to be doing. Here's what they're actually doing. And the fact is that the Supreme Court, 99% of the time, has been a bulwark against popular democracy to improve people's lives. It's been absolutely an institution of reaction within the system. Which is why they kind of allowed judicial review to happen in the first place. But yeah, it was interesting.
Yeah, for sure. You know, David Griscom, who works on the Michael Brooks show, they've continued to do the Michael Brooks show. And I know I've been plugging that show a lot, but you should check it out because it's very good. He went on this tear about, you know, the upside of court packing is just disempowering the court, making it a little weaker. So, you know, short term, that would be a positive. But I love all of the historical context that Samuel Moyn brings up and what really needs to happen in order to have a true democratic process and system in this country.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's move on to SALT. And look, SALT used to be, we're going to dunk on Dave Rubin, but it's just low hanging fruit. So we're going to talk a little bit about someone who's also low-hanging fruit, but he said something that I think, unfortunately, is shared by many people who might not have the guts to say it so publicly, but it should be addressed. So now that Donald Trump gets to stack the Supreme Court with conservative judges, pro-corporate judges, individuals who are likely to strike down the Affordable Care Act, many Americans are rightly concerned about losing healthcare coverage if they have pre-existing conditions. For all the flaws that the Affordable Care Act has, and we've discussed them at length, there were some certain protections through the Affordable Care Act that are important, protections for pre-existing conditions. It's not talked about a lot, but it also helped to expand Medicaid programs on a state level, which would then help to ensure that people living in poverty would have healthcare coverage. All of that is really under threat now. And so Erickson chimed in on this debate and said the following: I don't think the government should force coverage for pre-existing conditions. I think it is bad policy that will lead to increased healthcare costs and diminish the need for personal responsibility. Eric Erickson is a trash human being. Because healthcare is not supposed to be a commodity. And to make this ridiculous, simplistic argument that we can keep healthcare costs low simply by focusing on what individuals can do on an individual level is stupid. It's stupid. No one decides or chooses to get cancer.
Right.
You know, it's just, anyway.
No matter how much personal responsibility you exercise, like you could get, I don't know, some disease that I probably never even heard of. It just, sometimes there's just bad luck. So no amount of personal responsibility can account for that. But Eric Erickson is an interesting figure in American politics because I remember like on TYT maybe a couple weeks ago, we talked about that staffer who was just kind of honest about, it was like a staffer for like a North Carolina guy who just said like, yeah, no, if you don't have health insurance and you have cancer, like, yeah, you should die and you can't afford it. Yeah, sorry, you should die.
Yeah.
You know, they commit the biggest sin in American politics, which is just telling the truth. And that's the truth.
Honesty,
he's being honest about his views. But Eric Erickson in particular is the almost perfect example of a trend that has happened in the last 10 or so years that Alex Perrine talks about a lot, which is that in the past, the sort of denizens of the Republican Party, the sort of leaders of the Republican Party kind of understood that, you know, they needed to feed red meat to the rubes every once in a while to keep them like whipped up and voting Republican. But really all they cared about was like lowering capital gains taxes and doing wars abroad and stuff. And like all these kind of hot button social issues. Like they themselves didn't really believe it. They read the Wall Street Journal. They didn't listen to right-wing talk radio, like which was like for the crazies and for the rubes. At one point, roughly around 10 years ago, roughly around when the Tea Party came about, the sort of inmates took over the asylum, so to speak. And those people, the rubes, are now the people in power in the Republican Party. And Erickson, the transition that he did from like Red State, when he was like the editor of Red State, which at the time was seen as like this like crazy right-wing blog, to being a CNN on CNN, like he was a CNN contributor. This was like they hired him kind of to be like the Tea Party guy, you know. And at the time, it was seen as like this crazy hire, you know. Like now, all the Republicans, like even like all of them, are Ericksons. You know, like that transition has been fully complete.
No, I love that you brought that up. That's such a good point. And I mean, if you look at the other side, if you look at true like leftists, how many leftist contributors does CNN have?
No, none.
I mean, it was
zero.
When Bernie was still in the, you know, when the primaries were happening, he was still had a good chance of winning the primaries.
Yeah.
Chris Cuomo was the only one who ever brought either me or Cenk onto his show to make a robust case for Bernie. And I give him credit for that. But that was the exception, right? I mean, I haven't seen a progressive or
you would
leftist
think from like a
on
cold
CNN.
capitalist point of view, they would recognize, like, go look at all these people. They love Bernie. We need some Bernie people to talk. Maybe we'll get them to tune in every once in a while. And like, no, it's like, it's so outside of their, like, they just don't even consider it. It's like as if it didn't exist. It's crazy.
Yeah, it is crazy. And for me, there's just this on every major issue that really has like a fundamental negative impact on our lives, right? We keep hearing this argument, not just from right wingers, by the way. I hear it from liberals as well. This notion of personal responsibility. On the climate issue, liberals pushed personal and have continued to push personal responsibility, as opposed to keeping corporations that have contributed the most to climate change accountable for their actions, right? So, you know, we're sucking our cocktails through paper straws that disintegrate in like 2 seconds because we're doing our part for the environment. But at the same time, you have Gavin Newsom signing new permits for fracking in the state of California. It's infuriating.
It's a great point. I mean, that I hadn't really thought of it that way, but it really is just the other side of the same coin. It's you know, it's Meatless Mondays. It's recycling, which turns out to be a giant scam, apparently. It's all pushing it onto the individual rather than looking for actual collective solutions that change the distribution of power. No, it's exactly. That's a good point.
And and when you really like put it in context, it's even worse because we subsidize these industries, which then turn around and destroy the environment. We have to pay the costs of this destroyed environment, right? Like we have to deal with the ramifications while they've made their profits. And then on top of that, the onus is on us, right? Like, oh, would you look at that? Climate change is real. We need to do something. No more, you know. And by the way, I'm fine with banning plastic bags and plastic straws. Like, but my issue is that the onus seems to always 100% be on us as individuals, when in reality, the people in positions of power who have, taken advantage of the environment and have taken advantage of this commodified healthcare model, you know, they're off the hook. We don't have to worry about them. It infuriates me. And one other example of that, real quick, was this tweet by New York Times Business. John Mackey,
favorite business.
John Mackey, the founder of Whole Foods, blames obesity on bad decisions by consumers rather than lack of access to healthy food. And here's a quote: "It's less about access and more about people making poor choices, mostly due to ignorance."
The rubes, you know, they're just too ignorant. They like their Hot Pockets and their McDonald's, and they're just all fat and gross since they just shopped at Whole Foods and gotten, vegan matcha tea or whatever. Like, they'd be better off.
If they only spent $25 on a canister of pre-cut cucumber in cucumber water, then they would be okay. They're just ignorant. That's the problem.
They're just ignorant. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's just but it's like that it's been absorbed because it's been beaten down into us since we were little kids, right? That this idea, it's such a deep part of the American psyche, I find, is just this.
Yes.
And it's like, and it kind of translates it when it kind of gets burned inside of you, it translates into like a form of self-loathing that I find, to be very, and they love that. They instill that upon you. Like, if you're fat, it's just because you're a disgusting, gross, person who doesn't know that you should be doing healthier life choices. It's like, no, that's just not how that works. There's big collective solutions to the obesity problem. There's things that can be done, not just like shame people for liking McDonald's.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, how about we look into why it is that the United States is particularly unique in obesity and all of these problems, and what are other countries doing correctly? Like, there's this very active effort to prevent Americans from doing any type of comparative analysis between our system and systems in other countries.
Yeah.
And I think it's because we're not the best. We are messing up in a number of different areas. And in order to actually do things correctly, we need to challenge capital. We need to challenge people in positions of power. We need to challenge this entire system. And we're getting a little taste of what that looks like when you want to do something as mild as demand that police officers stop shooting and killing people on the streets. It's like, hey, maybe we don't want to live in a society with extrajudicial killings. And, people's heads explode. It's pathetic. Anyway, so let's bring on Kale. Kale, what's going on?
Hey, guys.
Kale, you look great.
Thanks, dog. You look good too.
Thank you.
The comments are always talking about how much they love you, Nando. I think Anna's obviously gorgeous, and the audience knows that. And we have multiple channels to show that. But people only get a taste of Nando once a week on the Jacobin channel, and they're like, "Who is Nando?" they're just not watching Univision, or not Univision, Fusion. And what are you doing these days?
No longer. That was like 4 years ago, dude. It's okay. Yeah. Okay.
I don't really distinguish between.
Well, thank you to the people at home. I'm humbled.
Nando, the Jacobin audience is a big fan of the Hispanic movement.
Oh yeah! Oh my God! Can we please talk about that? This is the greatest thing any politician has ever said. Oh my God! Trump on his standing with Latinos.
Folks, we are polling at numbers.
Yeah, numbers, folks. The numbers, polling at numbers that I guess no Republican has ever polled before. Perhaps Abraham Lincoln. But in those days, he wasn't big into the Hispanic movement, I think. Abraham had other things to think about. Don't we think? Oh, my God.
Don't we think?
Don't we think? He has some other things to worry about. He had the guy coming behind him in the theater. The bad man came with the gun. He wasn't big into the Hispanic movement.
He's unintentionally funny, right?
Actually,
he's not.
Yeah. No, he's trying to be funny, kind of. I mean, I think he's trying. I think he knows that he's trying to be funny. I mean, I wouldn't call him I don't know. What do you think, Kale?
He's obviously a showman and it's a performance, but it's like the way that it's filtered through his brain that he understands that social issues are filtered, things like immigration, for instance, or citizenship rights, predominantly because in this country it gets taken up by middle class people rather than working class people and working class movements. It becomes these representational or diversity related cultural issues of are we seeing enough Latinos in our ads or in our workplaces? And by workplaces we actually mean boardrooms. There's plenty of Latino people in the kitchens or the people preparing foods at a fast food restaurant, but no, of course, the way it's filtered through his head is the Latino movement. And
well, I think Lincoln, to be fair, was he was like a big anti-Mexican Mexican American War advocate. So maybe he was bigger into the Hispanic movement than Trump is giving him credit for.
Big fan of the Latino movement.
I don't actually know. I need to,
movement, folks.
We gotta call up Matt Karp on that one.
Yeah, call up Matt Karp. Yeah,
but I mean, well, first of all, before
it's also,
we go any
but
further,
also the fact that he's the president is just like if he was just saying this on a stage and he was just some guy, it wouldn't be that funny. But the fact that the president of America, the most powerful person ever to ever have walked the face of the earth, is like saying that stuff, it makes that adds a layer of comedy to it, like a sick version of comedy, but it adds the layer of comedy.
He also does this thing very often where he like removes himself as the president, where he's like,
yeah,
folks, we should be doing this thing. They're not doing this thing. It's
right.
like the they in that sentence is you.
Yeah.
Okay, but to be fair to him, like Twitter has made it clear that a lot of politicians do that, and it makes me crazy. Like it makes me crazy, especially when Democratic lawmakers are on Twitter and they're like, I'm very upset. Someone should do something about this. And it's like, what do you think
You're the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi.
Right.
Oh, God, it makes me crazy. Yeah. But look, with Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, though, I've kind of come to accept that maybe it is better that they do the Twitter thing, because their inability to do any type of public address is damaging to any progress in this country. Like their effort. Have you guys seen that YouTube ad where Chuck Schumer appears on the screen after Stacey Abrams and he's like, I'm asking you to what is up with that delivery? I hate that ad. Like it makes me want to I hate that ad so much.
I'm asking you for money right now. The Democrats are in a really bad situation. We're probably going to lose unless you donate $20. And also, I'm burning. My skin is literally burning right now.
His glasses are like hanging off the edge of his nose. You could tell he's like looking down at a script. There's like no enthusiasm in his voice. So yeah, if they want to tweet rather than do any type of like press conference or public address, I got it. But I'm mostly talking about what happened.
When they did the kente cloth, like it's better just to tweet than to do something as embarrassing as the kente cloth, which is just like, it's got to be some sort of psyop to turn people off the Democrats. I don't know. It's just like I couldn't believe that.
And by the way, I was kidding. I would never donate to Republicans. That was a joke, just in case. Yeah.
Just in case people were worried about the red-brown alliance that Jacobin is notorious for.
Yeah, the Nazbol.
That's us, folks.
Yeah. Strasserite, Kale. You're a Strasserite.
Wouldn't be the first time I've been called that.
Really? Damn.
That is.
I've never been called that. Yeah.
No.
No. I'm not doing. I must be doing something wrong. I think if you're being called a Strasserite, you're doing something right.
Right. If you're not being canceled like all the time, you're not challenging power. Like
right.
And
I've yet to be canceled. Anna's been canceled. I've yet to be canceled, I think. I don't know why.
You'll get there. You're doing more on air. You'll get there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, you should tweet more. You should be more online.
Right.
So this is the part of the show where we take your questions. And I didn't mention that before I came on, and then we just started riffing. But people have questions. Also, please hit like, please hit subscribe. There's quite a few of you watching.
Tell your friends, tell your parents, tell your daughters, tell your brothers and your sisters and your cousins. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Tell them all right now.
Right now.
Email.
Call them up.
So we have one person has already asked a question. They asked, why do you think the media always ignores the obvious systemic issues in those feel-good stories? And is there a way to fix that through legislation? Anna, do you want to pick that one back up, or?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I don't know what the solutions are. Really, I get a little uncomfortable when it comes to any type of regulation because we're dealing with this insanely corrupt political system, and I would rather not have them decide what type of regulations would impact media and journalism. But I will say, like, I'm going to speculate as to the reasons why legacy media outlets tend to ignore the systemic issues that happen to be the root of the problem, right? First off, when it comes to television media, you guys got to remember that the hosts are millionaires. Like, they're incredibly wealthy and disconnected from what most of us are experiencing. And then on top of that, you have to look at their business model, right? So if their business model is, you know, reliant on advertising money, well, their corporate advertisers are not going to like the type of commentary and the type of coverage we do on a show like this. And so, and then I also think even
Verso.
all of this, you know, hands off Verso. We're not, and Verso is great, but that's the thing. I mean, people like us who work at Jacobin and the Young Turks, finding advertisers is impossible because there's this, you know, there's a huge disclaimer in these deals indicating that, like, we're not going to allow anyone to censor us in any way. And so advertisers pull out immediately because they know that they're probably going to get criticized based on the type of content we do. But even before people get hired and get paid millions, I think that the hiring process plays a role as well. You want to hire like-minded individuals, so you don't have to censor them. These are just things that they already believe. And what they believe is that there aren't systemic issues and we should just focus on, like, charitable nonsense instead of reforming the system.
Yeah. There's like a really famous Noam Chomsky interview with some, like, British guy, and, you know, and the British guy is challenging Noam Chomsky. He's like, see, no one has called me up today to tell me, like, you know, give me the list of questions, and no one's given, you know, like, no one has called me up, and he's like, and Noam is like, he responds and he's like, yeah, they don't need to. Like, you believe certain things and you sincerely believe them, and that's why you're in that chair. If you believe different things, you wouldn't be in that chair. And you know, I've worked in the corporate media, and I've seen it from the inside in the newsroom. Again, it's not the smoke-filled suits calling you up to be like, hey, could you, like, not do that? It's more of like it filters down institutionally, and there's just, like, a whole lot of what's called self-censoring. You know, like, you know that you shouldn't, like, slap the hand that feeds you. Most people kind of know that instinctually. You have to be a certain kind of like polemicist or something to go after the hand that feeds you, you know? And most people just aren't like that. And so they understand kind of on some instinctual level that they can't really challenge power when it comes from when you're existing in this, like, for-profit environment. And which is why, like, I always think about a lot, and it's like a thing that used to be a bigger thing on the left, is the belief in a public media. I know, like, Amber Frost has talked about this at some point. Like, the news is a public good that should be funded by all of us, like electricity or water, or, you know, it's the same. You need information for a society to function, and therefore the people should kind of have a stake in control of the information, and some form of, like, a public media that is that is public but also kind of independent of whomever you know is in power, which is, like, the tricky kind of way to structure it. But you need some sort of public media that is accountable to people, not accountable to corporations, essentially.
I totally agree with that. And one other thing I just wanted to add: every once in a while, one of these cable news networks or mainstream media outlets will screw up. Maybe they don't do their homework, and they'll hire someone who actually does want to challenge power. And there are smoke-filled rooms, like in 2010 and 2011, when Cenk was hosting on MSNBC. Was very critical of the Obama administration because, first of all, he was right. Obama was making all sorts of awful policy decisions. And he, Cenk wanted to do a fair show that doesn't just hyper focus on Republicans, but also keep liberals accountable for their actions. And he was called into Phil Griffin, that's his name, I think.
Phil Griffin was the head of MSNBC. Yeah, he was the head of MSNBC. Yeah.
He told Cenk that MSNBC, they're not outsiders, they're insiders. And he said something along the lines of, outsiders, they're cool, they wear leather jackets, but we don't do that. Like something along those lines, which is like the cheesiest thing I've ever heard in my life.
Yeah.
But Cenk turned down, and he never talks about this. It drives me crazy because it gives you a sense of what kind of person he is. He turned down $1 million contract, $1 million, because he refused to be censored by MSNBC. And like, you know, believe me, he is not making $1 million right now. And probably never will. But
yeah. No, the classic case of Phil Donahue getting
up MSNBC and was like, "Hey, what's up with this? What's up with this dude? Like, what? Tell him to shut up."
I remember when Cenk was on MSNBC. I remember that really well. I was like, "What's going on here? Like, this is not gonna last." It was like I had to I like understood that was like, you know, that wasn't gonna last very long. But like I remember, I mean, I'm old enough to remember when Phil Donahue was fired from MSNBC for opposing the Iraq War. I mean, think about that. You know, like. It wasn't even a partisan thing. Like Cenk was going after Obama, who's like, you know, Phil Donahue was going after Bush, you know, like the other side, and he got fired. So, yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, what both of you just said, I think that's basically it. But I would just add one more piece that for the skeptics out there that want to push back against the like, oh, this sounds conspiratorial, the smoke-filled room argument, and like, I think. A lot of times, like, because it is like a power structure, like a pyramid that goes up to the top where it's like just a couple people up there who are making workplace decisions for everyone below them and basically political decisions for their employees. And I think part of it is just those like, you know, anti-left kind of political or ideological reasons. But part of it also is competition. It's like, the name of the game with capitalism, like, and this might even sound a little dogmatic, and I think this is something that you, our lovely viewers, should just like consider and then like test or like in circumstances when you're thinking about like, why are these corporations doing what they're doing? Fundamentally, like the driving force in capitalism is competition. It's like either you get a relative advantage against your competitor, or you risk losing out and like dropping below your profit margin, and the whole thing is over. And so like, and competition is so fierce in capitalism, and like we feel the competition as workers, as people in labor markets trying to get jobs, but like, and obviously it's horrific because it's like work or starve. But for a capitalist, like, and we're thinking about like right now news media, like they're not thinking long term because they can't. They're thinking like week to week. Like they have to make sure that the ratings are up, that the ad revenue is coming in. And if they make a decision that is like, let's focus on like actually why something horrible is happening to these people, rather than just like the feel good. I mean, really not feel good. Typically it's like the heart wrenching story about like what we just talked about earlier in your segment, Anna. Right. Sorry, what?
Like Blaze, that poor little boy who
exactly
was given up by his parents because they can't afford healthcare. Like, how is that not the story? How is that not the heart of the story anyway?
Right. Because if they don't do the thing that's going to drive in viewers, and it typically are those more emotional things. It's not like let's talk about the structure of power in society. Like, it's going to mean a dip in ratings, and it's going to mean a dip in profits. And like, just like fundamentally their existence as a corporation is now in jeopardy. That like, so it's both the individual decisions, and a lot of it is that, especially in something like media, but like just at the corporate capitalist level of what's going on, like, that's it. Like, it's either make profits or you lose out and you die.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, when the news had to compete with entertainment for attention to survive, because this is new. People don't realize this. Like, if you know the history of the news media in America, like especially TV news used to lose tens of millions of dollars a year, and it was almost a source of pride for the newsrooms and any network. They had to keep the newsrooms and do the news by law. But the newsrooms lost money, and they didn't have to compete for attention because there's only 4 networks, and they basically all had the same time slot. So they didn't have to compete with like an entertainment property. And that's when the news kind of became more entertainment, was when it was forced to compete against entertainment. It's like what you're talking about. Like, the name of the game in capitalism is competition, and the competition, you know, is what is, it's a race, in a way, it's a race to the bottom also in terms of quality. I mean, as problematic as the BBC is from a news standpoint, and it very much is, but its presence in both, and its freedom from the bottom line, or the quarterly bottom line, and its mandate to kind of elevate programming, like kind of slightly above what the just the bare bones of like your guilty pleasure. It's like why some of their programs, like their shows, are like just of a higher quality. They don't have to debase themselves, if that makes sense. Like there is something to be said about just not having to worry about the profits for the next quarter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And remember, the BBC came out of the British welfare state. It came out of the Labour Party and the trade unions, like gaining power in that country. Like it's not generosity from the rich.
No.
It's working people taking control over their society and saying, we deserve fair and decent media and fair and decent reporting. We're kind of at time, but I wanted to do one more question.
Do it, baby.
To see what you guys think.
Late, so we can go a little over for the people.
That's right, all for the people. Someone, T-Sound asks, did y'all catch the story about New York MTA workers being busted for having secretly made their own break room? Wasn't it considered normal to have break rooms in the past? So if you are familiar.
I did not see that.
I didn't see it either.
I only caught bits and pieces of it. That I knew that it happened, but I just haven't been able to follow exactly. But to answer the latter question, yes. And it's, the same reason that I just said with the BBC, which is that like there would be no reason for your boss to give you a break room because of competition. They need to constantly make more and more profits. So like the idea that you have a break in the day, or like let alone a pee break, like actually like cigarette break, or like just talking to your coworkers about anything, like cannot be allowed.
Forming a union. I mean, that's one of the things, like the break room. I know for like in education circles, like the break room is seen as like an important thing because it's like the bosses aren't around, and that's the whole point. And, the bosses don't like things like a break room because that's when the employees can just kind of hang out and talk. It's like, hey, isn't it fucked up that like this thing happened and like maybe we should do something about it, But like if the boss is watching, they're not gonna do anything about it. So yeah, that's why they hate the break room.
Right. And I would just add a little book recommendation because that's what we do on this show. If you haven't read Harry Braverman's Labor and Monopoly Capital,
I have not.
It's one of the most important books of the 20th century. Just like, honestly, it is like for what it's describing and analyzing, and what it's describing and analyzing is the invention of what's called scientific management, or Taylorism, in the early 20th century, which is essentially this question of how do we get our workers working at the same pace that they are right now to produce even more things. And so sometimes that's technology, but what Taylorism is different means of managing the workplace, figuring out how to move people around, figuring out, like, for instance, like getting rid of like break rooms. Like, so when we're thinking of like open air or open, what's the right phrase? I guess like open offices where like, it's like, as much oversight as possible.
Bloomberg innovation. Yeah.
Right. It's as much oversight as possible. And then it's de-skilling workers to the greatest extent possible so that a worker who, is on an auto line or something, they know how to do that job as an auto worker better than someone who makes shoes for a living or something. Right. Because there's very specific job requirements for that job. But if you take away all of the specifics of that job and you just make it so like they're just operating a machine, they're just pressing a button, they're just moving a lever, like you can replace them that much easier. You can then get the shoe guy to come in and do that job too. And so this is scientific. They like figured out how to replace people and make them more replaceable by like actually altering like the work itself and the workplace that this happens in. And so like we are living through one of the worst periods of like working class destitution, where like MTA workers who, like, in the middle of a pandemic, like keeping the MTA clean, keeping the MTA running, and keeping like essential workers to actually get to their workplaces, doing an invaluable public service, they get the hammer dropped down on them by their bosses because the boss is obviously a pig and cruel, but like it's competition. And so like, fuck the boss, but fuck capitalism. Like you have to do both. You have to say both.
Got to say both.
Is what incentivizes the boss to act the way he or she does. But this system, I mean, it dehumanizes us. And then that extends to us dehumanizing each other. So I think that a lot of like what we're experiencing with social unrest in this country is tied to how this system dehumanizes us. Like we need a general strike. Like it just needs
something.
Well, we need, at the very least, we need a revived labor movement. We need labor militancy, and can't wag a magic wand and get it. It's so kudos to the MTA workers and any other workers who are like trying to get a little bit of decency in their lives.
Oh well.
Appreciate you. On that note, I'll let you guys sign off. It's been a great show. Sam was awesome. Thank you both. And thanks to our audience, of course. And hit like and subscribe if you haven't already, because we do this every week, and every week it gets better. So come join.
Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching. Thank you, Nando. I'm not going to lie. I did not do as much work on Friday night for this show as I typically would. I need a little bit of break. So today was a bit of a scramble, but we're pros.
You made it look seamless. You're a pro. You're pro.
Yeah, right.
They didn't
Right.
notice.
I mean, my tech took a crap right before we were supposed to start the show. That's why you guys have this terrible camera.
You still do it.
We're there. So as Kale mentioned, please like and share this video. Share this with everyone you know. Try to get the message out there. We love hearing from you guys as well. So thank you for your questions. And yeah, have an excellent week. We'll see you next week with another episode of Weekends.